The radar operator's hand froze over the plotting table. It was 11:23 in the morning, on June 19, 1944. The young petty officer stationed at the air search radar unit on Guam stared at the scope, watching the returns multiply across the screen. He counted once, then again, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. The blips weren't scattered reconnaissance aircraft or a small strike package. They were a formation, massive and organized, moving toward the Mariana Islands at over 200 knots. He grabbed the field telephone, connecting him to the command post. His voice was steady despite what he was about to report. Multiple contacts bearing 095 degrees, range 130 miles, closing fast. Count exceeds 200 aircraft. There was silence on the other end of the line, then a sharp intake of breath. The operations officer asked him to confirm. He looked at the scope again. The formation was so large it appeared as a solid mass on the radar display. "Confirmed," he said. "Estimate 200 plus inbound." The message went up the chain immediately. Air raid warning. Launch all available fighters. Scramble everything that could fly. But the mathematics were unforgiving. Japanese air bases in the Marianas held approximately 230 aircraft of all types, scattered across Guam, Tinian, and Saipan. Many were bombers, reconnaissance planes, and transports unsuited for air combat. Perhaps 150 were fighters capable of intercepting the incoming strike. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Ground crews ran toward revetments, where Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters sat waiting. Pilots, many of whom had been eating lunch or resting in the tropical heat, sprinted toward their aircraft. Mechanics pulled engine covers and checked fuel levels. Armorers loaded ammunition, belts into wing guns. The entire base transformed from routine patrol operations to emergency combat readiness in minutes. But 11 minutes was all they had, from radar detection to enemy arrival over the target. 11 minutes to start engines, taxi to runways, take off, climb to altitude, form up, and intercept a strike package that numbered over 200 aircraft. It was impossible. Even under ideal conditions, with aircraft pre-flighted and pilots strapped in, getting 100 fighters airborne and organized into combat formations would take 30 minutes minimum. The Japanese pilots who made it into the air that morning launched knowing they would be outnumbered, disorganized, and fighting at a disadvantage. They climbed hard, pushing their engines to maximum power, trying to gain altitude before the Americans arrived. Some never made it off the ground before the first bombs fell. Others were caught during takeoff, vulnerable and slow, perfect targets for the Grumman F-6F, Hellcat fighters escorting the strike. This was not how it was supposed to be. This was not the war Japanese naval aviators had trained for or expected to fight. Something fundamental had changed in the 18 months since they had struck Pearl Harbor with overwhelming force and perfect surprise. The Americans had built something the Japanese could not match, could not counter, and could barely comprehend until they saw it with their own eyes. The question was not whether they could stop this strike. The question was whether any of them would survive it. To understand what happened over the Marianas that June morning required understanding what Japanese naval aviation had been and what its pilots believed about themselves. The Imperial Japanese Navy had built its carrier aviation force on principles of quality over quantity, elite selection over mass training, and technical excellence over industrial scale. These principles had worked brilliantly for years. They had worked right up until they stopped working. Japanese carrier aviation began in earnest in the 1920s, when the Imperial Navy commissioned its first purpose-built aircraft carrier, the Hosho, in 1922. The ship was small, displacing just 7,500 tons, but it established the organizational and tactical foundations that would define Japanese naval aviation for the next 2 decades. Flight operations, deck handling procedures, and pilot training programs developed aboard Hosho would evolve but retain their essential character through Pearl Harbor and beyond. The Navy established its pilot training program on the principle of producing a small number of exceptional aviators rather than a large number of adequate ones. Candidates faced rigorous selection. Physical examinations eliminated anyone with less than perfect eyesight, hearing, or reflexes. Psychological evaluations tested for aggression, decisiveness, and emotional stability under stress. Academic requirements demanded strong performance in mathematics, navigation, and technical subjects. Only about 5% of applicants passed initial selection. Those who did enter training faced a program that lasted 3 years from entry to operational assignment. The first year focused on basic military discipline, physical conditioning, and academic subjects, including navigation, meteorology, aircraft recognition, and tactics. The second year introduced actual flight training, starting with primary trainers and progressing through increasingly capable aircraft. Students learned takeoffs, landings, formation flying, navigation, and basic aerobatics. The washout rate was high. Perhaps 30% of students failed to complete flight training. The third year focused on advanced combat training and carrier qualifications. Students learned gunnery, dive bombing, torpedo attack, and carrier landing techniques. Landing on a carrier deck was and remains one of the most demanding tasks in aviation. The deck was short, moving, and surrounded by ocean. The approach required precise speed control and exact glide path management. A mistake meant crashing into the stern or missing all arresting wires and going into the barrier. Japanese training was unforgiving. Students practiced until they could land consistently in any weather condition the Navy might encounter. By the time a pilot received his wings and assignment to an operational squadron, he had logged hundreds of flight hours and demonstrated mastery of every aspect of carrier aviation. The Navy considered him ready for combat. More importantly, it considered him an investment worth protecting. These men represented 3 years of training, thousands of yen in resources, and irreplaceable experience. The Navy used them carefully, rotating them through combat assignments and rest periods, preserving the core of experienced aviators while bringing new graduates into operational squadrons gradually. The aircraft these pilots flew reflected the same philosophy of technical excellence and qualitative superiority. The Mitsubishi A6M0, introduced in 1940, was perhaps the finest carrier fighter in the world when it entered service. Its design emphasized the characteristics Japanese doctrine valued most: range, maneuverability, and climbing performance. The Zero could fly over 1,600 miles on internal fuel, giving it an operational radius that exceeded any contemporary carrier fighter by hundreds of miles. This range allowed Japanese carriers to launch strikes from positions far beyond enemy counterattack range. It meant Zero fighters could escort bombers to distant targets and return safely. It provided a cushion of safety that American and British carrier forces could not match in the early war years. Maneuverability was equally impressive. The Zero could outturn any Allied fighter in 1941 and 1942. Its lightweight, low wing loading, and large control surfaces gave it a turning radius that seemed impossible to pilots who encountered it for the first time. In a turning fight, the classic dogfight, where 2 aircraft circled, trying to get on each other's tail, the Zero was supreme. American pilots who tried to turn with Zeros died quickly. Rate of climb was the third critical advantage. The Zero could climb to 20,000 feet in 7 minutes 30 seconds, reaching combat altitude faster than most opponents. This meant Japanese fighters could intercept incoming raids with altitude advantage, attacking from above where speed and surprise compensated for any other disadvantages. It meant they could disengage from unfavorable fights by climbing away from opponents who could not follow. The armament was adequate for the targets Japanese planners expected the Zero to engage. 2 7.7mm machine guns in the nose provided high rate of fire for close-range work. 2 20mm cannons in the wings delivered heavy, hitting power against bombers and ground targets. The cannons fired slowly, only about 60 rounds per minute, but each shell carried enough explosive to damage or destroy an aircraft with a single hit. Against the lightly built aircraft the Zero encountered in China and in early Pacific battles, this armament was devastating. But these capabilities came with trade-offs, Japanese designers accepted willingly. The Zero had no armor protection for the pilot, no armored seatback, no armored glass windscreen, no armored bulkhead behind the cockpit. This saved weight, improving performance, but left the pilot vulnerable to any hits from behind or below. The Zero had no self-sealing fuel tanks. When bullets punctured the tanks, fuel streamed out and often ignited. American fighters with self-sealing tanks would lose fuel from bullet holes, but the tank's rubber lining would swell and seal the puncture. Zero tanks simply leaked until they were empty or caught fire. Japanese designers knew these vulnerabilities existed. They accepted them as necessary compromises to achieve the performance characteristics doctrine demanded. The philosophy was clear. A highly skilled pilot in a highly maneuverable aircraft would avoid being hit. Defensive protection was less important than offensive capability. If the pilot was good enough, he would not need armor because he would not get shot. This philosophy worked brilliantly when Japanese pilots were indeed highly skilled and opponents were unprepared. In China, where Japanese naval aviation first saw extensive combat starting in 1937, Zeros destroyed Chinese aircraft with impunity. Chinese pilots, flying obsolete Soviet and American aircraft with minimal training, had no answer to the Zero's speed, climb rate, and maneuverability. Japanese pilots accumulated combat experience, refined their tactics, and built confidence in their equipment and training. The strike package that appeared on Japanese radar screens that June morning in 1944 represented something entirely different from what Japanese naval aviation had become. It represented American industrial capacity applied to carrier warfare with a systematic thoroughness that would have seemed impossible 3 years earlier. The numbers told a story Japanese planners had refused to believe, even when their own intelligence officers presented the evidence. The strike consisted of 208 aircraft launched from Task Force 58, the fast carrier task force of the United States Pacific Fleet. This was not the entire task force's air wing, merely the first wave of a planned series of strikes against Japanese positions in the Marianas. The task force itself consisted of 15 carriers divided into 4 task groups, each built around 3 to 4 carriers with supporting battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. 15 carriers. The Japanese combined fleet at that moment possessed 9 carriers of all types, including light carriers and converted ships. The Americans had committed 15 fleet and light fleet carriers to a single operation. This disparity was not an accident or a temporary advantage. It was the product of an industrial mobilization that had transformed American shipbuilding capacity into a machine for producing aircraft carriers at rates Japan could not hope to match. The Essex-class fleet carrier program exemplified this transformation. The first ship, USS Essex, was laid down at Newport News Shipbuilding in April 1941. The Navy ordered 24 ships of the class during the war. By June 1944, 9 Essex-class carriers were operational in the Pacific. Each displaced 27,000 tons standard, 36,000 tons fully loaded. Each carried an air group of roughly 90 aircraft. Each could steam at 33 knots, fast enough to keep up with the fleet and outrun most surface threats. The construction process for an Essex-class carrier took approximately 18 months from keel laying to commissioning under wartime production schedules. Newport News Shipbuilding, New York Naval Shipyard, Bethlehem Steel's Fall River Shipyard, Philadelphia Naval Shipyard, Norfolk Naval Shipyard, and Bethlehem Steel's Quincy Yard all built Essex-class ships simultaneously. The Navy had created production capacity to complete a fleet carrier every 2 months on average, across all yards combined. This production rate was possible because American shipyards had automated and standardized construction techniques that Japanese yards lacked. Prefabricated sections built in separate workshops were lifted by massive cranes and welded into place on the hull. Electrical systems, piping, ventilation, ducting, and internal structures were assembled as complete units and installed as modules rather than built piece by piece aboard ship. Workers specialized in specific tasks, becoming highly efficient at their particular job rather than attempting to master all aspects of shipbuilding. The workforce itself represented a transformation in American labor. Women constituted a significant percentage of shipyard workers by 1944. They welded hull plates, installed electrical systems, riveted deck plating, and performed virtually every job in the yard except the heaviest lifting tasks that required exceptional physical strength. The famous Rosie the Riveter propaganda image represented real women doing real work building real warships. But carriers without aircraft were useless, and aircraft without pilots were decorations. The Americans had solved both problems through industrial and training programs that operated at scales Japan had never attempted. Aircraft production from American factories in 1944 averaged over 9,000 aircraft per month across all types. Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation alone produced over 12,000 F-6F Hellcat fighters during the war. The Hellcat was specifically designed to counter the Zero, incorporating lessons learned from early Pacific combat. The Hellcat was heavier than the Zero, weighing 9,200 pounds empty compared to the Zero's 3,900 pounds. This weight included armor protection for the pilot, self-sealing fuel tanks, and robust construction that could absorb battle damage. The Hellcat could not outturn a Zero in a slow-speed dogfight, but it did not need to. American doctrine had evolved to exploit the Hellcat's advantages: superior speed in a dive, better high-altitude performance, heavier armament, and the ability to absorb punishment that would destroy a Zero. The armament difference was particularly notable. The Hellcat carried 6 50-caliber machine guns, 3 in each wing, with 2,400 rounds of ammunition total. Each gun fired at roughly 800 rounds per minute. In a 2-second burst, a Hellcat could put roughly 320 rounds into a target. The 50-caliber rounds were large enough and carried sufficient energy to damage critical aircraft components with hits anywhere on the airframe. The Zero's 20mm cannons hit harder per shell, but fired far more slowly and carried limited ammunition. Hellcat pilots received training that emphasized team tactics over individual dogfighting skill. They flew in pairs, with a leader and a wingman who protected each other. They avoided slow-turning fights where the Zero excelled. Instead, they used diving attacks from altitude, making a single pass at high speed and climbing away before the Zero could respond. If a Zero tried to follow them up, the Hellcat's superior high-speed performance and climbing ability at high altitude gave them escape options the Zero lacked. This tactical evolution was taught systematically to every naval aviator graduating from American training programs. Those programs had expanded dramatically from pre-war levels, when the Navy trained perhaps 100 new pilots per year. By 1944, the Navy was graduating roughly 1,500 pilots per month from training bases scattered across the United States. The expansion of American pilot training represented a fundamental shift in how the Navy approached aviation. Before the war, naval aviation was a small elite force where every pilot was known personally to his commanders. The training program was thorough but slow, producing graduates who had logged hundreds of hours and mastered every aspect of carrier operations before joining operational squadrons. This worked when the Navy operated 3 carriers and needed perhaps 200 operational pilots at any given time. War changed everything. The Navy needed thousands of pilots, needed them quickly, and needed them trained to a standard that would keep them alive against experienced Japanese aviators. The solution was to industrialize pilot training using the same systematic approach that industrialized shipbuilding and aircraft production. The Navy established a pipeline that took young men with no flying experience and converted them into combat-ready carrier pilots in approximately 1 year. The program began with elimination bases, where candidates received approximately 10 hours of flight instruction in basic trainers. This initial phase weeded out those who lacked aptitude or nerve for flying. Perhaps 20% washed out in elimination training. Those who passed moved to primary training, where they flew for roughly 3 months, logging approximately 75 hours learning basic aircraft control, navigation, and formation flying. Intermediate training followed, lasting another 3 months with approximately 75 more hours in more powerful aircraft. Students learned aerobatics, instrument flying, navigation over water, and basic combat maneuvers. Advanced training split students by specialty. Those designated for fighters received training in gunnery, dive, bombing, and air-to-air combat tactics. Those designated for dive bombers or torpedo bombers received specialized training in their attack methods. The final phase was operational training, where newly designated naval aviators joined training squadrons that simulated combat conditions. They practiced carrier landings on training carriers, learned radio procedures, flew formation with other aircraft, and practiced the specific tactics they would use in combat. By the time a pilot reported to his operational squadron in the fleet, he had logged approximately 300 hours total flight time and had demonstrated competence in every task he would be expected to perform. This was far less flight time than Japanese pilots received in their 3-year program. A Japanese naval aviator entering combat in 1941 had typically logged over 600 hours and had years of experience in military discipline and culture. But the American system was producing pilots at a rate the Japanese could not match. In 1944, the Navy graduated more pilots every 2 months than Japan graduated in an entire year. The mathematics were brutal for Japan. Every pilot lost in combat was irreplaceable in any meaningful time frame. Japan's training infrastructure could not expand to meet wartime needs. Training bases in Japan proper lacked fuel for extended flight training, as American submarines cut off oil supplies from the Dutch East Indies. Experienced instructors were pulled from training duty to fill gaps in operational squadrons, reducing the quality of instruction for new students. The washout rate increased as standards were lowered to push more graduates through the program faster. By mid-1944, Japanese naval aviation was in crisis. The attack on Pearl Harbor had been executed by approximately 400 highly trained pilots, with an average of over 600 flight hours each. The carrier battles of 1942 at Coral Sea, Midway, Eastern Solomons, and Santa Cruz had killed or wounded hundreds of these irreplaceable veterans. The grinding attrition of the Solomons campaign from August 1942 through February 1943 had consumed entire air groups. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Japanese commanders watched their pilot rosters with growing alarm as the names of experienced aviators disappeared, replaced by graduates with minimal flight time and no combat experience. A Japanese carrier air group in mid-1944 might have only a dozen pilots with combat experience from 1942. The rest were recent graduates with perhaps 200 hours total flight time, less than the American pilots they would face. The Americans, meanwhile, had implemented a rotation system that preserved experienced pilots while blooding new ones gradually. Combat. Veterans returned to the United States after 12 to 18 months in combat zones. They became instructors, passing their hard-won knowledge to training squadrons. They taught the tactics that worked and warned against the mistakes that killed. Then, rested and retrained on newer aircraft, they rotated back to the Pacific with new squadrons. This system maintained institutional knowledge while preventing the complete exhaustion that came from extended combat duty. It also meant that American squadrons always had a core of veterans who could lead less experienced pilots, teaching them through example and keeping them alive through their first combats. The Japanese had no such system. Experienced pilots stayed in combat until they were killed or too badly wounded to continue flying. The morning of June 19th began with routine patrol operations for Japanese forces in the Marianas. Search aircraft launched at dawn to sweep sectors around the islands, looking for the American fleet that intelligence reported was somewhere east of the islands. The searches found nothing initially. The American carriers were operating beyond the range where Japanese commanders expected them, exploiting the longer range of their aircraft to strike from positions that kept them relatively safe from counterattack. At 10:37 in the morning, a Japanese search plane finally located elements of Task Force 58, approximately 160 miles west of the American carriers. The pilot transmitted a contact report giving approximate position, course, and composition before American fighters from the Combat Air Patrol intercepted and shot him down. But the report reached Japanese headquarters on Guam. Admiral Kakuji Kakuta, commanding the 1st Air Fleet based in the Marianas, immediately ordered a strike launched against the reported position. The Japanese managed to assemble approximately 69 aircraft for this first strike. They were a mixed formation of Zero fighters, Nakajima B-6N torpedo bombers, and Yokosuka D-4Y dive bombers. Many pilots were recent graduates with minimal combat experience. The formation launched between 11:30 and noon, heading east toward where the American carriers were supposed to be. They would never reach their targets. American radar detected the incoming raid while it was still over 100 miles away. The radar technology aboard American carriers had improved dramatically since the war began. The SK air search radar could detect aircraft at ranges exceeding 100 miles under good conditions, giving defending fighters ample time to climb to altitude and intercept far from the fleet. Fighter directors aboard the carriers watched the radar returns, calculated intercept vectors, and began vectoring combat air patrol fighters toward the threat. The Americans had over 50 F-6F Hellcats in the air already as combat air patrol when the raid was detected. More were launched immediately from the carriers, scrambling to reinforce the intercept. The Hellcats climbed hard, pushing their engines to maximum power, racing to get altitude advantage before the Japanese arrived. Fighter directors guided them precisely, calling out bearing and range to the incoming raid, stacking fighters at different altitudes to ensure they could attack from above, regardless of the Japanese formation's altitude. The Japanese pilots never had a chance. The Hellcats hit them approximately 60 miles from the American carriers, diving through the formation in coordinated attacks. The Americans came out of the sun, high and fast, exactly as their training taught them. They made single passes, firing their 650 caliber machine guns in short, controlled bursts, then zooming back up to altitude for another attack. The Japanese formation disintegrated under this assault. Zero fighters that tried to turn and engage the Hellcats found themselves unable to catch the American fighters as they climbed away. The few Zeros that did manage to get into firing position discovered that the Hellcat could absorb punishment that would destroy a Zero. 50 caliber rounds punching through unarmored fuel tanks set Zeros ablaze immediately. The same hits on Hellcats, with self-sealing tanks, caused fuel leaks that sealed themselves, or fires that extinguished quickly. Japanese bombers, slow and vulnerable without adequate fighter protection, were slaughtered. One Japanese pilot who survived reported that his formation lost visual contact with each other almost immediately as aircraft scattered trying to evade the attacking Hellcats. He saw aircraft falling in flames all around him. He counted 10, then 15, then stopped counting as he focused entirely on survival. He jettisoned his torpedo and dove for the ocean surface, hoping to escape in the confusion. He made it back to Guam alone, unable to report what had happened to the rest of his formation because he did not know. Most of them simply never returned. The first Japanese strike wave had effectively ceased to exist. Of the 69 aircraft that launched, fewer than 30 made it back to their bases. Most were shot down by Hellcats during the initial intercept. A handful broke through to sight the American carriers, but were destroyed by anti-aircraft fire or additional fighter intercepts before they could attack. Perhaps 5 aircraft managed to drop bombs or launch torpedoes. None hit their targets. The Americans suffered minimal losses, perhaps 3 Hellcats shot down in the entire engagement. Admiral Kakuta did not know the full extent of the disaster yet. Radio reports were fragmentary and confused. He knew the strike had encountered heavy fighter opposition. He did not know that nearly 2/3 of his aircraft were already destroyed. He ordered a second strike prepared and launched. This wave consisted of approximately 128 aircraft, the largest single strike the Japanese would mount that day. They launched around noon, formed up, and headed east toward the American fleet. American radar detected them immediately. The pattern repeated. Fighter directors vectored Hellcats to intercept far from the carriers. The Japanese formation encountered defending fighters approximately 50 miles out from the task force. The Americans had more fighters available now, having launched additional aircraft from multiple carriers to reinforce the combat air patrol. Over 90 Hellcats swarmed the incoming raid. The result was another massacre. Japanese pilots found themselves outnumbered, outmaneuvered at high altitude, and unable to protect their bombers from the coordinated American attacks. The Hellcats worked in pairs, exactly as their training taught them. One fighter would make a high-speed pass through the formation. As Japanese fighters turned to engage, his wingman would attack from a different angle, shooting at aircraft that were distracted and vulnerable. The tactics were methodical and devastating. Approximately 97 Japanese aircraft from the second wave were destroyed. Some made it through to the carrier task force and attempted attacks. One bomb hit the battleship South Dakota, causing moderate damage but not significantly affecting the ship's combat capability. Another bomb near missed a carrier, causing minor damage from fragments. These trivial results came at the cost of nearly 80% of the strike force. The handful of Japanese aircraft that made it back to base landed with battle damage, wounded crew members, and shattered morale. The Japanese launched 2 more strikes that afternoon. Smaller formations scraped together from remaining operational aircraft and reserves. Both encountered similar fates. American fighters intercepted them far from the carriers and destroyed them in detail. By late afternoon, Japanese air bases in the Maranas were littered with empty revetments where aircraft had sat that morning. Maintenance. Crews had nothing to maintain. Armourers had no aircraft to load. Pilots sat in ready rooms with nothing to fly. The Americans counted their victory as operations wound down that evening. Over 300 Japanese aircraft destroyed for the loss of approximately 30 American aircraft, most of which were operational losses rather than combat casualties. Pilots who ran out of fuel trying to find their carriers in the dark ditched in the ocean. Some were rescued by destroyers and submarines positioned along the return route. Others were never found. But these losses represented aircraft and pilots that could be replaced quickly from the production lines and training bases back in the United States. The battle was immediately nicknamed the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot by American pilots and crew members. The name stuck in popular history, capturing the one-sided nature of the engagement. For the Americans, it was a triumph of systematic preparation, superior numbers, and better equipment. For the Japanese, it was catastrophe. The First Air Fleet had effectively been destroyed as a combat force. The few operational aircraft remaining in the Marianas could not meaningfully contest American air superiority. The islands would fall to American invasion forces in the weeks ahead without significant air support for the defenders. But the numbers alone did not capture what had happened. The mathematics of the engagement revealed something more profound than simply a lopsided victory. The Americans had launched over 450 sorties that day from their carriers, maintaining standing combat air patrols, launching strikes against Japanese airfields, and rotating fresh fighters into the intercepts. The Japanese had struggled to launch fewer than 300 aircraft total from land bases, and most of those never returned. Japanese commanders analyzing the battle in its immediate aftermath grasped for explanations that might make the disaster comprehensible. Perhaps American radar was more advanced than intelligence had suggested, giving them warning time that negated Japanese tactical approaches. Perhaps the new American fighters were significantly better than previous models, creating a capability gap that had not existed before. Perhaps Japanese pilots needed better training in formation tactics to maintain cohesion against coordinated attacks. All of these factors were true to varying degrees, but they missed the fundamental issue. The Americans had not won through technological secrets or tactical brilliance, though both played roles. They had won through industrial capacity, applied systematically to every aspect of carrier warfare. They built carriers faster than Japan could sink them. They produced aircraft faster than Japan could shoot them down. They trained pilots faster than Japan could kill them. Every element of the American system was designed for sustained high-intensity operations that could absorb losses and continue functioning. The Japanese system was designed around the opposite philosophy: preserve experienced pilots, maintain small numbers of high-quality aircraft, win through superior skill and careful planning rather than overwhelming force. This philosophy had worked when Japan fought enemies with inferior equipment and training. It collapsed when Japan faced an opponent with superior equipment, adequate training, and unlimited capacity to replace losses. A Japanese staff officer responsible for analyzing the Marianas battle wrote in his report that the most disturbing aspect was not the loss of aircraft, severe as that was, but the casual efficiency with which the Americans operated. American carriers launched and recovered aircraft continuously throughout the day, with apparent ease. They maintained standing fighter patrols over the task force at all times. They vectored fighters to intercepts with precision that suggested sophisticated radar and communication systems. They rotated fresh fighters into combat as others ran low on fuel or ammunition. This operational tempo was sustainable for the Americans because they had built redundancy into every system. If one carrier's radar failed, 3 others in the task group provided coverage. If one fighter direction team needed rest, another team took over without disruption. If aircraft were damaged or lost, replacements were available from the training pipeline flowing steadily from the United States. The system was designed to function despite casualties, equipment failures, and the inevitable friction of combat operations. Japan had no such redundancy. Each carrier was precious, each aircraft valuable, each pilot irreplaceable. Losses mattered immediately and catastrophically. The first air fleet destroyed at the Marianas could not be reconstituted in any meaningful time frame. The aircraft could theoretically be replaced from Japanese factories over a period of months, but the pilots could not be replaced at all. The training infrastructure did not exist to produce carrier-qualified aviators in the numbers needed to rebuild the air groups. The strategic implications were clear to anyone willing to see them honestly. Japan could not win an attrition war against the United States. Every exchange, even successful ones where Japanese forces inflicted casualties, favored the Americans because they could replace their losses, and Japan could not. The mathematics were unforgiving. The longer the war continued, the stronger the Americans became, and the weaker Japan became. Some Japanese officers had understood this before the war began. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, who planned and executed the Pearl Harbor attack, had warned Japanese political leadership that he could run wild for 6 months to a year, but had no confidence in a prolonged war against American industrial capacity. He had studied at Harvard and served as naval attaché in Washington. He understood American production capacity and knew what it meant when fully mobilized for war. Yamamoto was killed in April 1943 when American P-38 fighters intercepted his transport aircraft over Bougainville. His death deprived Japan of one of its most capable naval commanders, but it also spared him from witnessing the full extent of the disaster his warnings had predicted. By June 1944, the American industrial machine was operating at full capacity, producing war materiel at rates that would have seemed fantastical before the war. The carrier task force that destroyed Japanese air power in the Marianas represented just one element of American military capability in the Pacific. Hundreds of thousands of troops were engaged in operations across the theater. The logistics system supporting them moved millions of tons of supplies every month across thousands of miles of ocean. The submarine force was strangling Japanese merchant shipping, cutting off access to the resources Japan needed to continue fighting. Strategic bombers were preparing to begin systematic destruction of Japanese cities once bases in the Marianas were secured. The Japanese pilots who survived the Marianas turkey shoot returned to bases that felt like graveyards. Empty bunks where friends had slept that morning remained undisturbed. Personal effects of pilots who did not return sat waiting to be collected and sent home to families. Maintenance crews who had worked through the night preparing aircraft for the morning's operations had nothing to maintain. The aircraft were simply gone. For those who had launched that morning expecting to strike a blow against the American fleet, the psychological impact was profound. They had taken off, believing their training, their equipment, and their dedication gave them a fighting chance. Many were recent graduates who had been told they were joining elite carrier air groups with proud traditions and combat records. They had been taught that Japanese pilots were superior to their opponents through spiritual strength and intensive training. The reality they encountered destroyed these beliefs completely. American fighters had intercepted them far from their targets, with precision that suggested total situational awareness. The Americans had numerical superiority so overwhelming that Japanese formations were swarmed by multiple fighters simultaneously. American aircraft absorbed battle damage that would have destroyed Japanese planes and kept fighting. American pilots executed coordinated tactics that suggested extensive training and practice. The few Japanese pilots who survived and managed to engage American aircraft reported something even more disturbing than the tactical disparity. The Americans seemed casual, almost routine, in their destruction of Japanese formations. There was no desperation, no indication that the Americans considered this a difficult fight. They executed their attacks with mechanical efficiency, following doctrine that had been taught and practiced until it became second nature. One Japanese pilot captured after ditching his damaged aircraft near American ships told interrogators that watching the American carriers operate from a distance before his aircraft went down had been more demoralizing than the combat itself. He could see aircraft launching and landing continuously. He could see the organized chaos of flight deck operations proceeding smoothly despite ongoing combat operations. He realized that the Americans were so confident in their fighter defense that they continued normal flight operations while under attack. This casual competence, this assumption that they would win simply by executing their standard procedures, was perhaps the most devastating thing the Japanese encountered. It revealed a level of material and organizational superiority that made victory seem impossible. The Americans did not need brilliant tactics or desperate courage. They simply needed to do what they had trained to do, using the equipment they had in abundance, and they would win. The 11 minutes of warning Japanese radar operators provided that June morning had been militarily meaningless. 11 minutes was never going to be enough time to organize an effective defense against a strike package of over 200 aircraft. But those 11 minutes were historically significant for what they represented. They were the warning time before Japanese commanders in the Maranas discovered that everything they believed about their chances in this war was wrong. The mathematics were clear for anyone willing to calculate them honestly. 3 American carriers could launch over 200 aircraft in a coordinated strike. The Americans had 15 carriers in Task Force 58. The Japanese had 9 carriers total in their entire combined fleet, several of which were being used as aircraft transports rather than combat vessels because there were no trained pilots to fill out their air groups. The disparity in numbers was matched by disparities in pilot training, aircraft performance, radar technology, damage control procedures, and every other metric of combat capability. Japan lost the Pacific War for many reasons: strategic overreach that created enemies faster than they could be defeated, logistical vulnerability as merchant shipping was destroyed by American submarines, industrial limitations that prevented modern weapons production at the scale required for sustained warfare against a major industrial power, tactical inflexibility that failed to adapt quickly enough to American innovations. All of these factors mattered, but perhaps the most fundamental factor was the one revealed in the skies over the Marianas on June 19, 1944. Japan had built its military on principles of quality over quantity, elite performance over mass production, and technical excellence over industrial scale. These principles worked brilliantly against opponents who could not match Japanese quality. They collapsed catastrophically against an opponent who matched Japanese quality and overwhelmed them with quantity they could not hope to counter. The young Japanese pilot who watched his radar scope fill with contacts that morning saw the future in those returns. He saw over 200 aircraft inbound, knowing his side could barely put half that number in the air from all bases in the Marianas combined. He saw the mathematical reality that no amount of courage or skill could overcome. He saw 11 minutes that were never going to be enough, because nothing was going to be enough. The war was already lost. It would take 14 more months of fighting and hundreds of thousands more casualties before Japanese leadership accepted that truth officially. But for the pilots who launched from Guam that morning, the truth was already undeniable. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.